Well, I should say at the outset is, the Growth Commission, we're an independent group of economists, and we very much support what the Prime Minister has said about wealth creation. He has said that wealth creation is going to be the most important thing in his government, and we agree with that. Unfortunately, and we've done a series of budgets for the UK where we projected that you could get over the next 20 years 27% GDP per capita gains if you do certain things in terms of, broadly speaking, reduction of taxes, properly costed, of course, but particularly things like regulatory reform. So you mentioned planning reform. That would be one of those things. We also find that labour market reform is very important, holding the minimum wage where it is, not increasing it to levels that are above the OECD, well above other OECD countries, and also ensuring that you don't do things in terms of your energy policy that lead to massive increases in energy cost. That's the good news, I think, of what you could do. And we don't know what the budget, is going to say. So we remain hopeful that some of that will be accomplished. But there is a very strong not to do list, which includes some things that have been trailed about this budget. Certain things like raising inheritance tax by eliminating business relief, raising capital gains tax, employers' national insurance. If you look at all of those things, we agree that planning reform is one of the biggest movers, and evidently the Labour government wants to do that, so that is positive. But there's a lot of drag on that positivity coming from some of these other things that have been trailed. And far from a 27% increase in GDP per capita over the next 20 years, we're looking potentially at a loss of about 8% if all of the things that have been sort of trailed actually are done. And some of the biggest movers in those, capital gains tax is probably the biggest one.
Shanker, I mean, the Prime Minister speaks, however, of saying that those with the broader shoulders really need to bear a little bit more. And your do not list ultimately takes away that burden from those with the broadest shoulders. So ultimately, where do you get the revenue?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the things that have been, trailed, what would be on our sort of don't do list, are fairly static in terms of revenue effect in the short run. I mean, by short run, I mean within the next couple of years. But their downstream effects over the next 20 years really start to be felt. And because that's reducing GDP per capita, that's actually quite regressive. The people who are most adversely affected by those GDP per capita losses are the people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder. So, one way of looking at this is looking at the shoulders of those who can carry the burden. The other way of looking at it is look at the effects of policies on the people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder. And that's where the problems are. That's why we focus very heavily on regulatory reform. Where we agree completely with the government is the need for planning reform. That is about a third of that 27% increase that we have projected you could get in 20 years. So we support, any sort of planning reform, those kinds of regulatory reforms. But a lot of the things, and some of these things are not things that the Labour government has decided to do by itself. I mean, some of these things are things that are things that the previous government had put in train. So, for example, we recommended don't nationalise the rail service. Instead, do what the Competition and Markets Authority recommended, which is more on-rail competition. We think competition is actually how you generate efficiencies and productivity gains. So that was a policy of the previous government, which has been continued. Creation of a state-owned energy company, we don't think is the way to drive down the very, very high energy cost in the UK. And who bears those sorts of costs? It's the people at the bottom end of the ladder, not the people at the top. The people at the top can afford, to some extent, regulatory policies that damage GDP per capita. So those are the kinds of things that we're focused on. And it's important to point out that of that gain that we project you could get, a significant part of it, at least two-thirds of it, comes not from the tax side, but from the regulatory reform side. So that's where we think the emphasis needs to be. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that has been trailed has been more the old, thinking of static revenue gains through increasing taxes, without the commensurate regulatory reform that actually generates productivity growth.